They called him the Ghost, a man who lived right on the edge, between glory and collapse. An athlete who showed the world that intensity can be both power and destruction. His story isn't just about building muscle. It's about choices that change the course of a life. Get ready to dive into one of the most intense and controversial journeys in bodybuilding history. And before we kick this off, grab your pre-workout and roll with us. Because what you're about to hear goes way beyond the stage. It hits straight at the heart of anyone chasing the limits. A real story, raw and inspiring, one you won't forget. Steve Michalik was born on January 8, 1949, in Brooklyn, New York. From early on, his life was marked by struggles that would shape both his personality and his future career. Coming from a troubled home, he grew up in an environment where affection was rare but violence was common. That harsh reality sparked an inner fire that would later become his trademark. One of the deepest scars of his childhood was his relationship with his father. Steve often recalled the physical and emotional abuse he endured, memories that didn't just leave wounds, but also fueled his defiance. His older brother added to the pressure, constantly threatening to send him to an orphanage. Childhood, a time meant for lightheartedness, for Steve became a daily fight for emotional survival. On top of the abuse, Steve also struggled with serious health issues. He was born anemic and so frail that he needed iron injections just to stay conscious. The condition kept him from joining normal physical activities, which only deepened his sense of vulnerability. But instead of accepting weakness as his fate, Steve began to dream of becoming strong and unbreakable. Two influences gave him a new vision. A doctor, whose knowledge of the human body fascinated the boy, showed Steve how science could explain strength and vitality. And in comic books, one hero in particular grabbed his imagination, Captain America. Steve knew he couldn't literally be that superhero, but he realized he could build his own real-life version of power and resilience. Determined to rewrite his story, Steve picked up weights while still a kid. By age 12, he was sneaking into makeshift gyms, watching older lifters, and copying their moves. What was just a pastime for others became a mission for him, to prove to himself that he could break free from the image of the weak, sickly boy. The results were nothing short of shocking. In just a few years, the skinny, anemic kid had transformed into a strong, determined young man. He nearly doubled his body weight, something that stunned everyone around him. But the transformation wasn't just physical. It symbolized his psychological victory over a past filled with pain and abuse. That childhood of suffering mixed with resilience would become the fuel that powered Steve's bodybuilding career. He wasn't chasing muscle alone. He was out to conquer his inner demons. By his teenage years, Steve's determination started turning into real results. His intense training sessions soon led him onto the bodybuilding stage. In 1968, he won his first significant title, Mr. Norristown, and also placed third at Mr. New York City and Teenage Mr. America, proving he had the potential to go much further. The following year, 1969, he confirmed that his rise was no fluke. Steve won the Mr. Western New York, cementing his place in the competitive circuit. While most guys his age were chasing parties, Steve found purpose in grueling workouts and competitions that drained every ounce of his energy. His discipline and seriousness set him apart. But Steve wasn't just about lifting. Alongside bodybuilding, he invested in his education. He completed a course in commercial art and landed a job as a graphic artist, showing he had more than brute strength. He had creativity, too. That artistic side balanced out his heavy training schedule, proving that even with his obsession for bodybuilding, he still sought other outlets in life. This was also when his personal life gained solid ground. Steve married his childhood sweetheart, Thomasina, who became his strongest support system. She encouraged him, managed his diet, and made sure he had everything he needed to keep up his insane routine. On many nights, she'd stay up late just to prepare his meals, fully committed to her husband's dreams. But along with his growth came the trait that would define his legacy: obsession with intensity. Steve refused to train like anyone else. While others stuck to standard sets, he pushed past the limits with brutal drop sets and non-stop circuits. His training philosophy made it clear he was willing to go far beyond normal to achieve extraordinary results. His dedication blew people away at the gym. Guys would stop mid-set just to watch him train, because it was impossible to ignore. The way Steve attacked each rep, it was like his body and mind were fused into one. No wall, no hesitation. Every single movement looked like his last chance to prove his strength to the world, and that raw intensity was already building his reputation as an unstoppable athlete. So Steve's first steps in bodybuilding were about way more than early wins. They were the opening act of a career stamped by discipline, intensity, and a strong support system at home. By the early 1970s, he was no longer just the kid with potential. He was becoming a force on the bodybuilding stage. In 1971, Steve grabbed 2 huge titles, Mr. Apollo and Mr. USA. These victories showed that the young man who, just a few years earlier, had been fighting anemia and childhood trauma, was now a serious contender in the sport. He wasn't just competing, he was catching the eyes of judges and inspiring fans. The following year, 1972, he achieved what meant far more than a trophy. Steve won Mr. America, a title he dreamed about since he was a kid, when he associated it with his heroes like Captain America. For him, standing on that stage wasn't just victory, it was redemption, an answer to the fragile boy he used to be. That one locked him in as one of the top names of his generation. Around that same time, Steve was working on more than just his physique. He was building a public image. He published a controversial article titled "The Death of Bodybuilding," slamming the rising use of steroids in the sport. Readers and even major editors praised his courage. But years later, he admitted he was already using substances back then, revealing the article was more of a strategy to earn respect and credibility in the community. Even with that contradiction, the Mr. America crown brought him national recognition. His body symmetry, muscle density, and charisma on stage set him apart. Steve wasn't just another competitor, he was a show. His photos started appearing in muscle magazines, and young lifters across the country were pinning his pictures to their walls, dreaming of following his path. His image was also preserved in books and in the history of bodybuilding itself. One key example is the iconic pumping iron, which captured the rise of legends from that golden era. Steve showed up not only as a champion, but as someone exposing the darker side of the sport, the pressure, the risks, and the extreme sacrifices hidden behind the bright lights of the stage. That clash between glory and critique made him even more intriguing. Steve was both a symbol of overcoming limits and a living warning sign about the dangers of chasing victory at any cost. He knew exactly how to use his story and his voice to stay relevant, even when his own choices didn't fully match his words. So Steve's rise wasn't just a list of wins. It was the beginning of a more complex image, the champion collecting major titles, while also showing fans that chasing the perfect body carried a heavy price. And if there was one thing that really set Steve Michalik apart from other bodybuilders of his time, it was his training philosophy. He believed extraordinary results could only be achieved through total commitment. No shortcuts, no limits. That's how he created his legendary method, intensity or insanity. The system was brutal. Steve would crank out as many as 100 sets for a single muscle group in one session. That meant spending hours in the gym, hammering away at the same body part until complete exhaustion, often with no rest between exercises. For him, training normally was just a waste of time. The body had to be pushed to the edge, no matter the cost. The principle was simple but terrifying. Turn every workout into a war where quitting wasn't an option. His circuits moved from one exercise to the next at a relentless pace. Anyone who tried to keep up usually dropped out before the halfway mark. But for Steve, that was just the bare minimum standard of dedication. His motto summed it all up: death is no excuse for not lifting a weight. Steve repeated that line in interviews and to his students, a phrase that perfectly captured his belief that absolute intensity was the only path to greatness. Pain, sweat, risk, it didn't matter. Training had to go on until the body literally couldn't take another rep. But the truth is, that kind of method was only possible because Steve was also running heavy cycles of steroids. The workload was so insane that a normal human body simply couldn't handle it naturally. Chemistry became his fuel, keeping him going at that breakneck pace. And Steve never hid the fact that he would do whatever it took to stay in that cycle, even if it cost him his health. John Defendies, one of his protégés and himself a bodybuilding champion, once described the method in unforgettable terms. It was like throwing a baby into the pool to learn how to swim. That's how shocking and brutal Steve's training felt to anyone who tried it. Most guys couldn't even finish the first phases of the program. The physical and mental demand was just too extreme. Intensity or insanity became one of the most notorious systems in bodybuilding history. It inspired admiration, but it also raised uncomfortable questions. How far is too far in the pursuit of results? Steve didn't just create a training philosophy. He left behind a moral dilemma about the price of total dedication. Behind the image of the champion, though, lurked a much darker side. His obsession with being the best pushed him into increasingly reckless choices, turning his life into a walking chemistry lab. He consumed massive doses of steroids with zero concern for side effects. He even pretended to be a veterinarian just to get access to more drugs, proof of how far he was willing to go to keep his journey alive. And the extremes didn't stop there. One of the most infamous stories about him was the claim that he once ate monkey brains, convinced he'd absorb the testosterone from the organ. As insane as that sounds, it paints the picture of a man who had crossed the line from dedication into outright self-destruction. With all these excesses, his behavior started to shift dramatically. Training partners and friends recalled how Steve became more aggressive, short-tempered, and sometimes outright violent. The psychological toll of substance abuse, combined with the endless pressure to outdo himself, created a powder keg where even minor conflicts could explode into full-on confrontations. That spiral hit a chilling peak in 1986. At the legendary Night of Champions, Steve declared publicly that his ultimate dream was to die on stage, as if the final glory would be collapsing in front of the crowd. Some took it as poetic bravado. Others saw it as a grim sign of his mental state, proof of how far he'd slipped from balance. His mentality couldn't have been clearer: win at any cost. For Steve, no sacrifice was too big, no boundary too strong. That obsession turned him into a symbol of bodybuilding's most extreme face, a living warning about how far the chase for the perfect physique can drive someone. It's important to remember that back then, bodybuilding was still carving itself out as a professional sport. Rules were looser, especially when it came to substance use. But even in that context, Steve went far beyond what most were doing. He didn't just follow the current. He pushed everything to an almost unbelievable extreme. Those excesses built his legend, but also cemented him as a man locked in constant battle with himself. After winning major titles like Mr. Universe in 1975, Steve looked destined for the very top. Many thought he'd be a serious contender for Mr. Olympia in the years to come. But fate struck hard. Shortly after his big victory, he was involved in a severe car accident that completely altered his path. The crash was devastating. The injuries were so bad that doctors told him he would never walk again. For an athlete whose very identity was tied to his body, that diagnosis was like watching all his dreams crumble at once. For years, Steve was confined to a wheelchair, living with constant physical pain and the torment of seeing his once sculpted physique fall apart. To many in the bodybuilding world, it seemed his story was over, a star who burned brightly, only to be extinguished too soon. But Steve wasn't the kind of man who accepted limits. With the help of his brother Paulie, he began an almost impossible recovery process. Paulie would literally carry him from machine to machine at the gym so he could train, even without full mobility. On top of that, Steve leaned on Taoist concentration techniques, methods he claimed to have learned from monks during his military service. That mix of mental discipline and sheer willpower turned every session into a grueling test of endurance. Of course, there was a darker side to this comeback. The chemical abuse never stopped. Steroids and other drugs were his fuel to endure the pain and speed up recovery. In one sense, that's what allowed him to defy the doctor's predictions, but it also pushed his body further into breakdown. It was an enormous price to pay, and Steve seemed willing to pay it. Then, in 1980, against every odd, Steve Michalik returned to the stage at the Grand Prix Miami. It was a historic moment. None other than Arnold Schwarzenegger introduced him to the crowd as the Phantom Bodybuilder, the man who had risen from the ashes. From then on, the nickname became inseparable from his identity. Steve kept competing until 1984. He didn't rack up more big titles, but that didn't really matter anymore. Just the fact that he was back on stage after everything he had endured was seen as a miracle in itself. For fans and fellow lifters, his presence alone was victory enough. But while his comeback painted him as a symbol of resilience, the reality behind the curtain was much darker. During the 1980s, Steve's body began to collapse under years of chemical abuse and extreme training. He suffered constant hemorrhaging from vital organs, kidneys, colon, gums, even his nose. His body was sending clear signals. It was breaking down. The headaches were brutal, so intense and frequent that Steve became hooked on heavy painkillers like Percodan and Demerol. Instead of helping him heal, those drugs created a new cycle of dependence, digging him deeper into the hole. The man who once preached limitless strength now needed narcotics just to get through the day. Another crushing blow was what happened to his muscles. The tissue that had once symbolized hardness and perfection started to swell and deform. For someone whose entire identity was built around his body, watching that transformation was devastating, like seeing his life's greatest achievement dissolve right in front of him. The lowest point came at an event in Toronto. On stage, under the bright lights, Steve collapsed mid-performance, racked by convulsions. Organizers had to drag him off in a scene that left the crowd stunned. It was the first time the world saw in public what he had been hiding. Steve no longer had control of his body, and the threat of tragedy was very real. By around 1990, he finally made the most radical decision of his life. He quit steroids and all other drugs completely. The detox process was brutal, but it had to be done. For the first time in decades, he tried to walk a healthier path, even if it meant never again having the physique that once made him famous. From then on, Steve became a fierce critic of drug use in bodybuilding. He wrote articles, gave interviews, and spoke out against the same extremes he had once embraced. He turned his past into a warning, hoping to keep younger athletes from repeating his mistakes. It was as if he was finally living out the message he had written back in that controversial 1972 article, The Death of Bodybuilding. He also opened his own gym, Mr. America's Body Shop, where he promoted intense training but strictly drug-free. In this new phase, Steve tried to rewrite his story. No longer the poster boy for excess, he wanted to become a voice of conscience within the sport. Steve Michalik's final years were marked by a relentless battle against the consequences of decades of abuse. His body, already pushed through so many trials, began to collapse for good. He suffered a heart attack, developed tumors in his liver, and eventually faced severe kidney failure that led to a transplant in 2011. These health crises were the direct reflection of the life of excess he had chosen during his peak years. Even with those limitations, Steve tried to hold on to a routine that projected discipline and focus. He worked to live more balanced, guiding his students and speaking out in favor of a drug-free bodybuilding. But behind that image of strength was a silent enemy he could never shake: deep depression. The weight of his losses, regrets, and accumulated pain cast a shadow over everything. Quitting steroids and adopting a healthier lifestyle wasn't enough to undo the damage. His body never fully recovered. Every new diagnosis served as a reminder that the very body once seen as perfection was now a source of suffering. It was a cruel confrontation with his past, forcing him to face the painful truth of how high the cost of glory can be. Those close to him described Steve as still intense, at times charismatic, but often withdrawn. He could inspire with his stories of resilience, yet moments later sink into overwhelming melancholy. That contrast summed up his whole journey, both a hero and a victim of himself. On May 24, 2012, devastating news shook the bodybuilding world. Steve was found dead in his home at age 63, having taken his own life with a gunshot. The tragedy laid bare the end of a journey defined by both glory and torment, reminding everyone that behind the muscles stood a man locked in constant conflict. His death brought grief and reflection throughout the community. People mourned not only the loss of a legendary athlete, but also the fact that his life had become an extreme example of the dangers of obsession with the perfect body. Steve's legacy both inspires and warns, forcing athletes to reflect on the razor's edge between dedication and self-destruction. His story left deep marks on bodybuilding. He became a controversial icon, remembered as both a model of determination and intensity, and as a symbol of the risks of pushing the sport too far. His career can't be summed up by trophies and muscles alone. It's a raw portrait of the price that comes when ambition ignores every boundary. As the creator of the infamous intensity or insanity method, Steve influenced generations of athletes. Many admired his courage to push the body beyond what seemed possible, while others saw in his style a stark warning about the thin line between discipline and destruction. Either way, he carved his name into a sport that was still fighting for identity and global recognition. His life leaves an unavoidable question. How far is it worth going in the pursuit of physical perfection? Steve proved it's possible to turn a frail body into a powerhouse, but he also revealed how quickly that pursuit can become a one-way path to ruin. His story challenges athletes and fans alike to think not only about the muscles they can see, but also about what gets lost in the shadows of that chase. That's why, even with all the controversy, Steve is still remembered. To some, he's an inspiration, to others, a warning. But either way, you can't ignore him. His name still sparks debate, precisely because his life was a paradox of triumph and tragedy. The nickname Arnold Schwarzenegger gave him back in 1980, the Phantom Bodybuilder, stuck for good. A phantom because he came back from the dead after an accident that should have ended him forever. And a phantom, too, because he represents the shadow that hangs over bodybuilding when the hunger to win pushes past every limit. Even after his death in 2012, Steve Michalik's memory is still alive, in documentaries, magazine articles, gyms, and even in debates about health and performance in sports. His extreme intensity has become a case study, showing both the jaw-dropping results a human body can achieve and the deadly risks of ignoring its warning signs. That's why Steve's legacy remains a striking chapter in bodybuilding history. He'll always be remembered as the man who dared to push past the human limit, who shined under the stage lights and inspired thousands, but who also paid the ultimate price for his choices. So, what did you think of Steve Michalik's story, the legendary Phantom Bodybuilder? A life of triumph and tragedy that forces us to ask, how far is it really worth going in pursuit of perfection? I'd love to hear your take. Which part of this journey hit you the hardest? Drop it in the comments. I can't wait to read your thoughts. If this video brought you any value, don't forget to hit that like button. It helps a ton in reaching more people who are also drawn to these powerful stories from bodybuilding. And if you're not part of our community yet, go ahead and subscribe. Then ring the bell so you don't miss what's coming next. You can also become a channel member to unlock exclusive content and directly support the continuation of this project. Every new member makes our mission stronger, to preserve and share the incredible stories of athletes who left their mark on generations. And of course, share this video with that friend who loves lifting, overcoming obstacles, or just great stories. Who knows, maybe Steve Michalik's journey will spark the same reflection in them that it did in you. Bodybuilding is built on legendary names, and each one carries unique lessons. Here on the channel, we've got plenty more stories that will surprise and inspire you. So don't leave just yet. On the end screen, you'll see another video handpicked for you to keep binging our content. Hit play, and let's keep traveling together through the world of bodybuilding, discovering the heroes, the struggles, and the backstage reality of a sport that's about so much more than muscle. See you in the next video.